Director David Midell also co-writes The Ritual, this one notable for starring Al Pacino and Dan Stevens. Now, I've seen a lot of chatter about this movie, how it's terrible and everything like that, and I have to ask, is it? Is this movie terrible? We'll come on to it. So, what's the story? Now, this actually is based on a documented case, so a true, you know, if you believe this sort of thing, case of exorcism, and actually takes place in the late 1920s. And it focuses on two priests, one played by Dan Stevens, the other by Al Pacino. One an experienced exorcist, the other played by Dan Stevens is a priest who's kind of questioning his faith, and he really has no clue about exorcism really, but for some reason they want to perform the exorcism in his church. So he can end up getting involved in it along with a kind of a bunch of nuns from his church. And there's this girl who gets sent there because they've exhausted all other kind of medical explanations, and they have to perform these rituals, these exorcism rituals that take place over a number of days. And it follows their attempts to try and combat this demonic force over the course of around about I think it's about 6 or 7 days of these rituals. What will happen? You have to watch the movie and find out. So, let's talk about it. Is this movie as bad as maybe the reputation suggests? No, I would say this is untrue. This is not a bad movie. I think the problem with this movie is there's so many exorcism and possession movies, and we'll come on to it in a little bit more detail in my negative section, but I just think it's just kind of, it doesn't really stand out. But it's not in itself a bad film. So let me just go into a little bit more on the positives, and then we will talk about the negatives, and we'll kind of touch upon that in a little more detail. So the positives. There's not much hanging around in this movie. You pretty much straight away, this possessed girl comes to this church, and you know, there's very little preamble in regards to seeing this girl first start to exhibit signs. I mean, she's already at the point where they have no choice but to bring her to the church at the beginning of this movie. So the whole movie, and this is going to factor in my negatives as well. So the whole movie is this exorcism basically. So it starts pretty quickly. Now, I thought before I watched this, one of the critiques might have been the acting, but I've got to say I thought the acting was fine. I mean, yes, you could say that Al Pacino is somewhat kind of sleepwalking through this role. You know, it's not one of his major roles he's going to be remembered for, but I don't think he's bad in it. You know, he's kind of doing the Russell Crowe thing where he's kind of got this sort of Italian sort of style accent, and you know, he's playing a little bit more of an eccentric kind of style sort of priest, but you know, if you liked the Pope's Exorcist with Russell Crowe, and you liked Russell Crowe's performance in that, I think this is kind of like on par with that movie for sure. I didn't think the performances were bad. I actually quite like Dan Stevens' character, who's this kind of similarly quite grounded priest, who, you know, he's a little bit of a kind of a goof at times, and you know, he seems quite sort of personable and stuff. He's dealing with the kind of the recent passing of his brother. I thought his performances were quite good, and pretty much everyone involved. I actually didn't think the acting was bad at all, and relatively kind of strong across the board here. I actually kind of quite like some of the way the movie depicts these nuns, for example, who are clearly kind of afraid. And throughout the whole exorcism, this possessed girl is scaring these nuns, and they're like really afraid to be there, and kind of like nervous messes through the whole film. So it's not as if these are like stoic sorts of individuals who have seen it all and are ready to face these demons. They are terrified, and a number of them get hurt in this, you know, in this exorcism, and they don't really want to be there, and that's kind of consistent through the movie. So I kind of quite like the way the movie depicts these kind of group of nuns, and to a degree Dan Stevens' character as well, as really being quite afraid of this, and not having, even though they've been in the church for a while, they've really not come across anything like this. And Dan Stevens' character, for example, for a long time is convinced that it's probably a medical issue, and insists on getting kind of more medical professionals to kind of look at this girl. So I sort of quite liked it in regards to the way these sort of characters are directed and the way their reactions are kind of given, because it kind of feels like, yeah, you know, pretty much that's like kind of a believable reaction, even to someone who is, their career is in the kind of the church and things like this. The effects are relatively subtle in regards to our possession, but I gotta say, I think even though the possession starts quite early in the movie, and we kind of get this girl being fully possessed right at the beginning, the manifesting symptoms of it, shall we say, are increasing through the film. So she's getting more wounds and she's looking more sort of demonic as the sort of the film progresses. So even though she's definitely displaying stuff straight away in the movie, as the film goes on, she kind of gets worse, and so it has that sort of ticking time factor where you feel this demonic possession is getting worse as the movie is going on, and this girl can only kind of, her health can only kind of take so much. So I do think there is some interesting elements in this movie, and it does have a kind of a polished feel to it. This feels like it's a movie which has had a little bit more budget than, you know, the majority of your indie type possession films. So it has a kind of a polish and a sheen, a kind of a, you know, a mid-budget sort of movie might have compared to a kind of a low budget. So if you like, you know, movies that have a greater production value, yeah, then you would check it out. So there is stuff to kind of say on the positives on this movie. Don't necessarily go into this with these negative kind of connotations that I think this movie has maybe undeservedly got. However, so let's talk about the shoe on the other foot. It has to be said that this movie, although I do think in itself the movie has positives, it's so generic, I guess you would want to say, in its contemporaries. There's really nothing here to kind of make this movie stand out. So then this movie, to me, you have to look at, when you're judging a film, do you judge it based on its own merits, or do you judge it based on all of the other films that are similar to it? Because I don't necessarily think the latter is fair. It's similar in a way to shark films, because it's kind of hard to come up with an original concept for a shark film, or a possession movie in this case, because there's been so many versions of that story done, and there's only so many ways to tell this kind of similar story. So is it fair to judge a movie because what's come before it, or should we judge a movie based on its own merits? So that's kind of where I sit in this. But it is worth saying still that yes, I think the movie does have a little bit of an unfair reputation for being a poor film. When it isn't poor, it's just very much what you've seen before. But I don't think that necessarily means that this is a bad film. It's just somewhat of a kind of a, you know, a movie that kind of blends in to a degree. But it is still worth saying that, because yes, you won't really feel particularly inspired with this movie, because it does very much feel like business as usual in regards to sort of possession, exorcist films and stuff like that. So that has to be kind of said. However, within that itself, here's where I would say this movie does struggle. I think the movies needed to have more plot, because as I've mentioned, the movie starts more or less straight away with this girl arriving at this church, and then these rituals starting, and then that's it. That's your movie, right until the end. It's a series of kind of like exorcisms, rituals over the course of a few nights, and that's your movie. So there's not really much else in regards to plot. And I think this would have behooved the movie to kind of like reduce the amount of like rituals and stuff that it's doing over the series of nights, and have more plot at the beginning, have more kind of like, we see this girl before she gets possessed or something like that, and we have a, you know, we see the girl living her normal life, how did she get possessed, what you know, the first kind of incarnations of it, where people are taking her to these the doctors and stuff like that, and then we have a build-up to these exorcisms. Because at the moment, the movie is literally nearly like, well, it's 95% this doing these exorcisms. And as such, you know, they're well staged, but it's just, there's very, it lacks kind of like variation in its storytelling. And as such, you know, I was quite intrigued with this story when it first started, but as the movie kind of got to 2/3 of the way through, I thought, man, this is just, it's more of the same for this entire film. What we're seeing isn't necessarily badly made, it's just very, very the same film for its entire length of its runtime. So it needed a little bit more plot, it needed to have a little bit of variation in its storytelling and a little bit more facets to its actual story, because it's just like, it is literally rituals, the whole movie. And it needed to have more meat on the bones in regards to various kind of plot threads and stuff, but then they kind of hint towards a slight flirtation between Dan Stevens' priest and one of his nuns and stuff, and this doesn't really go anywhere. And ultimately it just becomes a little bit uninteresting because it's the same scenes over and over again. So there's that. There are a few things here that I think tone-wise seemed a little bit off to me. The movie, I think, is taking place in 1928, and outside of the beginning where we see a few cars on the streets, once you're in the church, it never really seems like it's that nearly 100 years ago. It almost seems a little bit modern to be 1928 to a large degree. And I think it's down to the fact that obviously we see nuns in, you know, the habits and all of that, and the priests in their priest garb and everything. So that really hasn't changed. So you really don't get the feel that the movie is a period piece to a large degree. It doesn't feel the way these characters are speaking and things like that, it doesn't necessarily, I don't think, really reflect 1928. And even some of the nuns, I think, look a little bit too glamorous. You know, they want to still look relatively attractive, at least that's how the film wants to depict it. And, you know, it looks a little bit glam at times, I would suggest. Now, I think, as I've mentioned, I think the movie has this sort of subtler possession, because I think it's trying to say that this was a true story, this was based on a reported true story, and as such, it doesn't want to kind of go too overboard with big VFX moments, for example, like the Pope's Exorcist. But at the same time, maybe it needed to land with a little bit more of pizzazz, a little bit more on show, because the movie has this kind of relatively consistent tone, and it never really kind of like raises its head above the parapet in regards to spectacle. It's all relatively subtle, and as such becomes, again, it falls into that being a little bit sort of drab to a degree, and never really sort of particularly like exploitative or thrilling or even scary. The movie is, I think, has good depictions of fear from our characters, but as an audience member, I think the subtlety and the consistent sort of fact that this movie has more or less the same kind of scenes over and over again, as an audience member, it lacks a little bit of bite. And you as an audience member are watching this, and it's the scene after scene of very, very similar scenes with only sort of subtle manifestations and slight kind of like growth in regards to the severity of the demonic possession. It's not exactly like terrifying stuff. So again, maybe it's trying to say this is how it was documented. This is trying to be truer to the documented events, which on one hand I admire, but when you're looking at it as a piece of entertainment, it becomes a little less thrilling. So overall, this is very much a middle of the road a possession movie. I certainly don't think it's a bad film, but it doesn't excel at any point either. There's really no point here where you can say, I'll remember this movie over other exorcism movies. And I would say its closest movie is the Pope's Exorcist, but that had more presence in a way, because it had a little bit more pizzazz at it. I think Crowe his character was a little bit more interesting, and it ended with a big VFX moment, which this doesn't have. So as a film, it's not bad. If you like possession movies, it is watchable. It is a well put together movie. It is just not particularly thrilling. It's certainly not original, and it needed to have more story in it. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.